Gun violence is of particular concern to us right here and now. You can't go really without any days and turn to the news and see some kind of shooting at a school or in a community or a mass shooting at a concert or elsewhere. And to help us get the handle on this and to learn how to be safer in the community and elsewhere, we here at 91.9 Public Affairs have begun a series on gun violence, safety, and control. And joining us here today in our studio, we have Chief Al Rivers Ansley from the Clarksville Police Department and Sergeant Chris Olson from the Montgomery County Sheriff's Department to help us make sense of things. And I think, gentlemen, if we break it down into 3 easy areas, let's talk first about, of course, there's investigation and prevention and education. First, let's talk about investigation. How often do you find, particularly in recent years, that you've noticed that gun violence has played a part in your investigations? And Chief, I'll start with you.
Yes, ma'am, much more frequently than in the past, no doubt about that. But it is very complicated, I believe, when you, for instance, in this past week, we've had 2 incidents where we, certainly one of them is well publicized, where we were on a barricaded suspect, and just had one last night with an armed individual. But we take probably more weapons off the street now than we used to. Our gun, as far as shots fired type activities, people shot at, things like that, actually have gone down a little bit. But to me, a lot of our issues are also tied into what's going on across the country and here as well with the opiate epidemic. Pills, things like that, that promotes theft. It also promotes violence. When you have people that are addicted to these substances and they cost a lot of money, especially on the street, they have to find ways to get them. So a lot of it is tied into that. We see our narcotic arrests themselves have risen tremendously. But as far as the violence, the gun violence, it has not taken that, it's not, we track it very closely. And it's a very complicated issue when you're talking about guns and gun violence. We can, I'm sure, expand on that and talk about responsible gun ownership, which we see a lack of a lot of times. But as far as in this community, and I'm speaking about this community only, as far as the gun violence and the violent crime has not risen tremendously as some people might think, but there are other things that are tied to it. But we do see definitely more, especially extremely violent people out there than what we used to. And I'll add that being a police officer today, and that's what I'm here to do, is talk about our side of it, is extremely difficult in who we have to deal with. Mental illness, that we're expected to deal with this issue. So to answer your question is yes, we see it. We've seen it for quite some time, and it has changed. What's out there on the street, what we see every day, has definitely changed over the years. And I've been in law enforcement for a long time.
Right, and then Chris, what about you? What have you noticed in the county?
Chief said it well. He prefaced pretty much everything well. Again, the violence issue is going to be an issue. It has been an issue. I think what we're seeing a lot more of is not necessarily a violence uprise as much as it's being the way it's being covered on the news. But violence is rising. It's rising all over the United States. And we do see a little bit more prevalent where 20, 30, 40 years ago, it was hand-to-hand, knife a little bit. We're seeing a lot more gun violence just because of the culture, the culture of the criminals, the narcotic type stuff. It's on the rise.
It is.
So.
Now, a follow-up question to that, how have you noticed with maybe necessarily incidents involving legal gun ownership versus illegal gun ownership? What have you noticed different-wise? And Chris, I'll take you first.
I don't know that we've broken down. We have opinions, and it depends on who you go ask and who's running what poll as to what opinion you get. I don't think that as far as, and I know for the most part, I know Tennessee does a real good job of keeping track of permit holders. Very, very, very low criminal activity with permit holders versus illegal gun holders. So I think if you go to the state of Tennessee and ask that question, they can probably give you a little bit better numbers. I can't give you numbers, but I know for just dealing in that realm, that the permit holder themselves, a very low rate.
Okay, and then Chief, what about you in the city?
I would agree with Sarge as far as legal gun permit holders. We don't, however, I mentioned responsible gun ownership, and I'll give you an example of that. Past 2 weeks, we've had no less than 8, 2 weeks I'm talking here, 8 weapons taken from vehicles, unlocked vehicles. And that's not what I call responsible gun ownership. And we do see, and I agree with Sarge, a lot of times you may be in a situation back in my day, and I'm an old man, I've been on the street a long time, whereas you would be in a bar and there'd be a lot of bar fights, and now you do see more of a, well, I'm going to go to my weapon. I've seen that. We had a homicide a few years ago with it at one of our local establishments, where I think that's basically what would have been a fist fight maybe 10 years ago turned into an innocent person being shot in the head. So, and I do not recall if the person that had this weapon was a permit holder or not, but I agree with Sarge as far as a permit holder. We do not see that as far as committing crimes or committing violent crimes. However, we do see some irresponsible gun ownership. We see it every day.
Absolutely.
For instance, I had a call the other day. It was not in our jurisdiction. An individual that I know called and said that he was fishing and some clown from the bank was firing a shotgun at his boat, or firing it into the water. I take it to scare him, and I think that the individual took opposition to the fact that he was fishing near the bank, and he shouted down to him that this is my land, and of course this guy shouted back, well, it's not your river. And he was actually armed, and he's a permit holder. He did not open fire back. I told him to report that to actually Montgomery County Sheriff's Office, because it's outside our jurisdiction. But that is an example right there. I think as far as responsible gun ownership, we do not see an uptick as far as looking at permit holders themselves committing crimes or violent crimes.
Now, what about securing your gun, say in your home? Obviously, gun owners who are licensed and are permit holders would want to keep that gun in a place where they could, reach it easily in case of a home invasion incident or something like that, yet also would want to keep things safe for when, say, they have young children at home. So what sort of, I guess, maybe precautions and sort of things to keep in mind would be good for, and either of y'all can take that question.
Responsible gun ownership depends on what you have in your house, kids, who has access to your home, relatives, friends. It goes everywhere from if you're by yourself in your home and nobody else has access to it, leaving a weapon out for self-defense, versus if you have small kids, taking the weapon apart, placing the weapon separate from the ammo, locking both of them up, and everything in between. So it really depends on the realm that you're working in.
Because I wanted to bring that up because obviously in the news that's been a concern. We had that accidental shooting, obviously, when a gun was nearby and a young person got that, and there was an argument over a video game controller, and a child died out of it. So.
Yeah, and we've had several, I know over the last few years, just in this jurisdiction, of children getting their hands on a weapon, and that's not what I call one very sad situation happened a few years ago where an individual was visiting with his family and he had a small child, and the child found the gun, which was on the bedside table. We've had a child get a weapon out of their mother's purse and actually pull the trigger. It does not take much pressure to pull a trigger on a Smith & Wesson 38. So that's responsible gun ownership, as Sarge said. You secure it. If you do have children, it's secured. There's gun locks, there's things you can do, but certainly you do not leave it out where the child can have any semblance of any access to that weapon. And we've had some very unfortunate, and I don't call them, well, it's an accident, but it's very, think about losing a child over something like that. It's just very sad, and we, as police officers, we certainly do not like going to that type of call.
And there's also, like he said, child, but unresponsible adults also out there that do silly things. So again, it depends on the realm that you're working in. If you're living by yourself, one rule may apply, whereas if you're dealing with other people, other rules may apply.
Definitely. Now to move on to more of our prevention aspect, what precautions have you, both in your respective departments, taken as you've seen different kind of situations that maybe would have not necessarily involved a gun before, now that they typically do? How do you change how you deal with those situations?
Well, if you're speaking on the officer safety side of
Yes,
this,
sir.
I'm a common sense type of person. It's you better, when you're out on patrol, you're making a traffic stop, you're dealing with any individual, any capacity, whether it's you're walking up to them to talk to them, to ask them to do a field interview, you're making a traffic stop, you need to have a mindset that this person's armed. Whether or not you believe it's legally armed or not, you have that mindset, because the culture has changed. We see many more weapons. Years ago, when I was on the street, you did not see an armed person. You did not see a person walking around with a weapon, because I guarantee if you did, we would take care of that situation. But you see it all the time now. And so you best, from an officer safety standpoint, with the mindset that you are dealing with a person that is most likely armed.
I agree with the chief. We treat and we train all of our deputies. Everybody's armed. And it doesn't necessarily make you a bad guy, because we do have the Second Amendment, and state of Tennessee is, we have carry permits, and that's not a bad thing. But we treat everybody as if they're armed, and our officer safety is trained according to, goes along those lines of everybody being armed. So.
And you do a lot of extensive training.
Absolutely.
Yeah, every
I'm sure both agencies, most law enforcement agencies do, in dealing with interpersonal communications, dealing with people that are armed. Because again, not everybody who's armed is a bad guy.
Right.
And I mentioned the two incidents we recently had. Within the last month and a half, we've had officers fired upon. So, we hadn't fired, not talking about the incident the other week ago, but just officers out trying to conduct a traffic stop, trying to take someone into custody were fired upon. And that is happening with much more frequency than in the past.
Now, what is regards for personal, like citizen safety, and those who may take gun classes in seeking gun ownership, what are some things they need to keep in mind too when they are working on gun safety themselves?
Number one is always treat a weapon as a loaded weapon. Never point it. We've seen that too many times, people playing around or whatever. Always treat, that's the number one rule, certainly, that weapon is loaded. Never hand a weapon to an individual without opening the breech. Never hand a loaded weapon to anyone. And when you accept a weapon, whether or not you're looking at it for a buy, sale, or whatever reason, you always check it. Too many mistakes are made. We see this a lot, and we see it here, not just across the country, where accidental discharges cause death or somebody hurt. So that's number one rule, is treat that weapon as it's loaded.
I agree with him. Lots of things. He's talking about the 4 cardinal rules of firearm safety. Number one, treating everything as if it's loaded. Can't count the times I've heard in my professional career of people being shot with an unloaded weapon because they assumed it was unloaded. And when you take a weapon, we call it, like the chief said, the condition check rule. Make sure that weapon is unloaded, or the condition of that weapon, before you do anything else with it. And then we go on to keeping your finger out of the trigger and be sure of your target and all that other stuff. But one rule, number one, like the chief said, treat all weapons as if they're loaded.
Definitely. Now, what about gun-free zones that we typically think about, areas where guns aren't allowed? How do you feel about gun-free zones? Do you think that they're effective, or do you feel, because I know there's been legislation recently to say, okay, maybe not have so many. How do you feel gun-free zones have maybe served or assisted in your enforcement?
If you mean about the state law concerning weapons, that has changed tremendously. For instance, basically you're mandated now to have, if it's a public building, to either have, basically you have somebody checking your, everybody that comes in that building, a metal detector. So how do I feel about that personally? I don't like it. I'll tell it like it is. I don't like it. I like if, such as a hospital or a police department, a sheriff's office, you should not be allowed to carry a weapon into that, into those type buildings. So that's my opinion. Might not be favorable to everybody, but that's the way I look at it.
Chris, what were your thoughts?
Thoughts. We have laws we have to follow. We have laws we have to enforce as law enforcement officers. And if that is the current law, then it's something we have to deal with. pros and cons. There's pros and cons to every law that are out there. I do know one thing, that I've never seen a gunfight in a gun show. So.
And I agree with Sarge, we do follow the laws. You asked my opinion.
Yes.
Right,
yes,
exactly.
yes.
I wanted to,
Yes.
and yes, and of course, obviously, you look at it from both sides,
Right.
your personal and then, of course,
Sure.
your professional sides of it. Good. Let's talk about schools just briefly, because I know school shootings, have, of course, been in the headlines, and I wanted to talk to you both about that. We did touch a little bit about gun safety. Let's talk first. I know, Chief, you have the Teen Citizen Police Academy. How do you think programs like that can help assist with better safety at schools?
I think going through our youth police academy is certainly a help. I think that, and I know SROs in schools are very important, extremely important. That's probably number one. To me, from my standpoint, is we talk about weapons. We talk about, number one is making sure you keep weapons away from people. You enact legislation that certain people should not own weapons. I don't want to bring up examples or name names, but there are certain times and people that we know them, we recognize them. When I'm out on a 17-hour standoff with that individual that is mentally ill, that individual, in my opinion, should never be allowed to purchase a weapon. So that is number one to me. Well, number one is making sure that your facilities are secure, making sure that you do everything you can to keep people out. There's a lot of things we do on that aspect too. But also to make sure that I'm all about gun ownership, all about the right to bear arms, not talking about that, but there are certain people that should not have that right, in my opinion.
And maybe mental screening
Exactly.
would be an important part of that.
Yes,
Okay.
ma'am.
I think the hard part of that is going to be threshold, though, and I agree with the chief for the most part. The hard part is threshold. I'm depressed today. Does that mean I have a mental illness? If so, does that preclude me from owning a firearm? So when you start talking about that slippery slope, we have to talk about that threshold. Is my only concern with that.
Definitely. Now, what about, I know, Chief, you recently took part in a forum about public safety, particularly at schools, and I'll get both of your perspectives on that in a moment. But we talked about SROs, their vital role
Sure.
that they play, and also drills. I know we've had, of course, here at Austin Peay, several local schools do them very rigorously in the wake of those school shootings. How well do you think they prepare students? Because we have some students who don't necessarily take them that seriously. They're just kind of like, oh, here we go again, we have to do a drill. What do you think about the role of drills in this?
I'll take it first. I think they're outstanding. I think we this morning actually talked about, we have been planning on setting up a large scale exercise this summer. West Creek High School, we have a very good relationship with them. They have a criminal justice program. And actually their principal, I know him very well, he used to work for us. So what we were talking about doing is not just an active shooter drill that involves us. We are looking at involving all the first responders, including how we respond, set up critical response, critical incident, how we would work with EMS, fire department to get people out once we make it safe, or at least make it as safe as possible. So to answer your question, we are actually planning that. I'm talking about also, we're looking at getting about 30 of their kids to volunteer to take part in the scenario. So as far as that go, I think it's tremendous. I think it helps us as well, how we respond. You know, we've been training for years since Columbine, as I mentioned the other night, you have a threat, you have an active shooter. We have been training, well, you have to negotiate that. You could be doing it by yourself. I'm out on patrol, I'm near a high school, I gotta go. You gotta go. You don't wait for the team, you don't wait for SWAT team, you're going. Hopefully you got somebody going with you, but you're going. And it's, as in Columbine back in, it was the mindset was I got to stand my post, I got to wait for the team to get there, SWAT team. That's not what we do now. So that part, we're talking about the whole 9 yards. We're talking about critical incident. We're talking about managing people to, you can just imagine how chaotic a situation like that would be. So we actually work on that. And that's why I'm glad I'm here, Because I want to tell everybody, we continuously work on that. You cannot ever get enough training. I think that, and we do plenty of it.
And to add what the chief said, everything he just talked about, we've been working on for the past 4 years, and we did that very same thing last year in service. Every officer, every deputy of ours that it runs the roads in any capacity, we went to West Creek last year, and we worked with EMS and fire. As soon as we got there, first officer response to team response to setting up the casualty collection points, integrated response with EMS going in to the warm zone, putting down the bad guy, securing the facility, and bringing everybody out. All of our deputies went through that very same training last year, and that was phase 3 of a 3-phase training that we've been through over the past 4 years. So.
And I like that you both bring up how much teamwork is involved.
Yes,
because I
absolutely.
don't think necessarily the public understands that there is so much behind the scenes that they don't see. And I know you probably particularly closely watched recent situations where we had, like what happened at Marshall County High in Kentucky, where it was very chaotic and we had children running, just running just everywhere. So could you please speak to that teamwork aspect?
For my prior agency, when I retired from Knox County Sheriff's Department in 2011, I actually responded to 2 school shootings up there. And it doesn't matter how big your agency is, it's going to be a multi-jurisdictional response and multi-professional response, EMS and fire. So it's imperative that we don't learn that, we don't get the test first and learn the lessons later. We have a great opportunity now to work with everybody. Since we know what's going on around the United States, let's learn these lessons together so when the test comes, we're way ahead of the game.
And Chief, what about you two?
Could not agree more. You said it very well. That's why we do what we do. That's why we train, so we don't. We learn from other mistakes, certainly. We learn from Columbine, definitely, how to respond. And putting that into as live as you can get it. Training, to me, is we have actually a live fire scenario house at our training facility. As close as you can get it to live training is the way to go. And that's why we want to get people involved, not just us run through it. We want to involve, as Sarge said, multi-jurisdiction, fire, EMS, Sheriff's Department. So to make sure, and we'll make mistakes. Communication problems. We have a communication problem. So we need to do these things to, okay, this was weak, this was strong. It's a lot of it involved, but we want to do it and make sure that that we do make, if it does, and pray to God it does not happen, but that we're ready. And I think, and I'm speaking for my department, and I know the Sheriff's Department as well, I think we are ready. I think I'm very proud of my department. I'm very proud of the officers at work. I think we've proved ourselves time and time again on, including this past week, about how to handle certain situations. So I know we're ready, but you can never get enough training.
I agree with them. The 2 incidents that I responded to in Knox County were chaos, untrained responses, versus the incident we responded to here at Austin, Peay a couple of months ago with the guy carrying the weapon, supposedly. The response there from the multi-jurisdictional response was a lot, you can tell it was a lot more educated response, a lot better flow. We can learn from it. The good thing is it's a lesson we can learn from, but from A to B, there was a humongous difference in the educated response versus the uneducated response. We're definitely on the right path. We're everybody working together. We're not there yet, and I dare to venture that we'll never get there because the mark changes. But we're a good ways there.
Definitely, and it's always going to take, I guess,
Absolutely.
lots more training and work together. Definitely,
Absolutely.
good. Now, along those same lines, school safety. Let's talk more a little bit more about school guns. I was reading a story out of the Associated Press a couple weeks ago about here in the state of Tennessee. It seems like that the guns at school seem to be maybe more than the national average, at least. That students bring firearms to school twice the national average, actually. And I understand that typically SROs do respond to those. But could you both speak to about why it's so important, obviously, for parents and the community members to be watchful and aware to help with this situation?
And those figures you have, we definitely, I know that the Sarge can speak on the SROs and how they handle situations. First, let me say we stay up on social media. We check it out. If we get a threat or somebody, or a tip that a certain individual may be instigating some violence at a school, we follow up on it. As I mentioned the other night at the school, Montgomery County School meeting, that we actually had one of those and we took charges on the individual. To me, if you're a 15-year-old kid and you make a threat like that, it's my opinion, you're going to be held accountable. The parents should be held accountable. If a child brings a weapon to school, where did he get that weapon, or she? And hold that parent responsible. I talked about responsible gun ownership. There's no way in the world you can tell me that if a child's got that gun in his handbag, how to get there. And if it got there and it's the parent's gun, once again, I'll say it. That's not responsible, and if they've got a permit, revoke it. That's the way I look at it. So those are things you have to take action on to do, and make sure that people do handle weapons. We just talked about how dangerous. It's not the weapon, how dangerous the weapon is. It's how dangerous the person handling the weapon is. So there's a lot of things I think you can do, and certainly we do. We work very well with the SROs if it's a threat made outside, and constantly working on that. We go to the quarterly meetings, stakeholders with Montgomery County school system. As I mentioned that night, we do checks on schools, with surprise checks that we're coming. If we make, for instance, we dress in civilian clothes, we get a team together. It's basically a school audit. If I walk through that schoolroom door and I get through, then that's a problem. So there are a lot of things we can do, and we will continue to do to make our schools safer.
And with that, with the past 3 or 4 years now, we've been going to the schools themselves and teaching the teachers and the principals on what we call civilian response to active shooter events. So we're about 60% of the way through our school system on this level of training. And the great thing about that is in teaching our schools, it teaches them not only to certain things like avoid, deny and defend when they need to, but it also meshes with our response. So the whole time they're dealing with their incident, they're prepping for our response, and we've been able to educate them on not only surviving but winning that fight, and again meshing with our response. So.
Great. So lots of good,
Yes.
helpful advice. And speaking along those lines, let's talk about, we're almost done with our interview, about education, how important education is in helping with gun safety. And Chief, let's talk to you first about education and what you do at CPD.
Well, I think as far as issuing gun permits, a license, that falls under the Montgomery County Sheriff's Office. But if we're at the, for instance, we have a CPA class. We're at the firing range. If somebody gets out of line, somebody has a weapon pointing downrange when they're not supposed to. It's kind of like I'm a strong believer in holding people accountable, as I pretty much made myself clear throughout this interview. But you do something that's stupid, you're going to be set out. You're going to be, hey, not going to tap you on the shoulder and whisper at you. If you handle a weapon irresponsible, you need to be held accountable. As I said, you leave a weapon out where a child can get to it, excuse me, but you're an idiot. So there are a lot of things we can do, a lot of things we do. And I'll close with this as far as my part is, I feel good about this community. I feel good about our department, the Sheriff's Department. We work well together, and I think we're very strong.
Great. And Chris, what were your thoughts?
Firearms, they're designed for one thing, and to kill. And if you don't have the ability to comprehend that and take that to heart, then you don't need a gun, first of all. And we treat everybody who carries a weapon in our agency, along with people who are associated with us, the same way. And in issues where we deal with the public, we treat them the same way. Now, we don't, of course, we don't issue permits, but the state of Tennessee does. And it's nothing for us to go ahead and go through the process of having that revoked when we see people that are not handling weapons properly.
Great. Gentlemen, both thank you for your time.
Yes,
Thank you
ma'am.
for sharing good information about prevention and, of course, your investigations and education when it comes to gun safety. And I'm Micca, Terrell with 91.9 Public Affairs.